Welcome to Off the Grid, a podcast for small business owners who want to leave social media without losing all their clients.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go off the grid. Okay. I know that you really want to put your phone away. Yeah. Let's go off the grid.
Hello and welcome back to Off the Grid, a podcast about living your life and sharing your work with no or minimal social media presence. I'm Amelia Ruby. I am the founder of Softer Sounds Podcast Studio and the host of this here show where I share stories, strategies, and experiments for cultivating community and making money without social media. We are currently between seasons of the podcast. We just wrapped up season 4 a few weeks ago and we'll head into season 5 in January. But this week I am sharing a few best of episodes to invite new listeners to the feed with some of our fan favorites. You might have heard me on We Can Do Hard Things this week. It was an honor to be a guest of Glennon, Abby, and Amanda. And if you're joining us because you heard me on that show, thank you so much for being here. I have selected these best of episodes specifically to complement the conversation that I got to have with the We Can Do Hard Things crew, and I'm really excited to share them with you. So the first best of episode I shared yesterday was my story of how I left Instagram, as well as a 5-step plan so you too can step away from any social media platforms that you might be ready to let go of as we head into 2025. Today's episode is going to go even deeper into that conversation, and I'm going to talk about the 5 stages of leaving social media. First, I'm going to go through the stages of grief that can arrive as we make the decision to leave. I definitely went through an entire grieving process when I decided to step away from Instagram. And then I will talk about what I learned after I left and the stages that I went through in the months and years since I left social media, because I've been off of all the apps for 3.5-ish years now, which is wild to think about and has brought up a lot in my life during that time. So because this is a replay episode, you might hear me mention things that are a little out of date, but I do promise that this episode is well worth returning to, whether you are a first-time listener or listening back time and time again. As always, I also want to invite you to download the free Leaving Social Media Toolkit, where you can find some great resources for putting everything we'll talk about in this episode into action. Just head to the show notes to grab that today. And for now, let's go ahead and dive into this episode on the 5 stages of leaving social media. I think for many of us here, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm assuming you're kind of part of this crew of people who have left social media or want to leave social media or feel really like you have to be there and you don't know how to deal with it, or like you've never wanted to be there even when you were. And I think for many of us, before we get to the 5 stages of leaving, we actually go through the 5 stages of grief first. Because we're grieving the dreams that we had for our social presence or for what our social presence would bring our business. We're grieving all the effort we put in and like stepping away from this place where we worked really hard and tried to build a beautiful community. Or even if we didn't do that work, we're grieving the idea of what we thought would happen for us there. We're grieving the death of that dream that I talked about, like the myth that we were fed, that we bought into when we made our social platforms or when we got on Instagram or when we got on TikTok. Like we have to grieve those things. So I want to acknowledge that and walk us through like how that can feel as it's happening. So I'm relying here on the 5 stages of grief, pretty common framework. The 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. This is not my framework, just pulling it from psychology and sociology. So when we're realizing we want to leave social media, I think we start with denial. We deny that we want to leave, and then we deny that we ever could. It's the sort of like internal monologue of like, no way do I actually want to leave this. It would be so much work. I could never leave. My business would never work without this. Deny, deny, deny. Then we get angry at the algorithm and sometimes ourselves, but often the algorithm. So I think the narrative there is sort of like, fuck this, I'm shadow banned, the platforms don't like me, they don't show my post to anyone, I hate it here, but I have to be here. So like we just get angry and deny and angry and deny. Step 3, we bargain. We go into this phase where we're like, okay, well, I can bargain with the platform, bargain with the algorithm, bargain with my boundaries. And there, I think the inner monologue goes something like, okay, well, if I only post this many times per week and I log off on the weekends and I do, X number of stories and Y number of feed posts, or I'm not going to do feed posts anymore. I'm going to make a feed wall and I'm only going to do stories, or I am going to do all reels because that seems to be what they like. But shit, now they've like deprioritized reels. So now I'm going to do something else. All of this is bargaining, like bargaining with the platform and bargaining with ourselves for how we can make this manageable for us. Then stage 4, depression hits. Here is the big, like, this sucks. I don't know what to do. Often in this stage, people will like temporarily log off. I see a lot of that, or step away for a period of time, or just generally feel kind of like malaise around like, okay, I did all my bargaining. It was working for a while. It's not really working and I don't know what to do again. And that's really bums me out. And then stage 5, acceptance. Not everybody gets here, obviously. I think I see a lot of folks, I talk to a lot of folks who kind of move through this like denial, anger, bargaining, depression over and over again and cycle through it with social media. But with acceptance, what I think this stage is at is a sort of like, okay, this is not working for me. Social media is not for me. I see it, I believe it. And often then what happens is a sort of like, well, I don't know what comes next. And I don't know what to do next. And this podcast, I would say, is really for people who are kind of like hitting that moment of like, okay, it's obvious that this is like a mess and it's not working and I'm not sure what to do and I need resources to figure out like how can I be off social media and still support my creative practice, my writing, my painting, my courses, my business. There are so many of you out there doing amazing things. How can you share your work and potentially, hopefully, make money, build a community, grow your audience without social media? That's where this podcast begins. But to recap, I think that there's just all the 5 stages of grief before that. And it's an interesting example or interesting application, I think, of that model because it doesn't necessarily start with a clear loss. I think that it can be really challenging to identify because often we get on social media without knowing really what we wanted from it. And so then we can't say, like, oh, well, I'm obviously not getting this. But we still find this discontent. I think we often enter the 5 stages of grief from a feeling of deep discontent with our experience on a social media platform, our experience making content for a social media platform. And then from there, we move through denial. I could never leave. Anger. I hate it here. Bargaining. Well, I'll do X, Y, and Z, so it's okay to stay. Depression. That's not really working. And acceptance. Okay, I need to do something else. So from there, my friends, is where we enter the 5 stages of leaving social media. Now, I want to be clear that this is not my 5-step plan for leaving social media. So that is a resource, a process that you can get in the free leaving social media toolkit and like work through. It's like step by step, like you're going to do this thing, you're going to do this thing, you're going to do this thing. It's very action oriented. The 5 stages of leaving social media are emotionally oriented. They're like how we feel and behave through this process. Like, what are we experiencing in our internal landscape as we are going through the steps of action to leave social media platforms? So, different things, but let's talk about those 5 stages. Most often, it starts with burnout. I think that by the end of grieving our social media presence, we're often exhausted. When I say we here, I'm really talking about myself, but also all the folks I talk to in this process. I've talked to, gosh, well over 100 people going through this by this stage, just through the courses and workshops and coaching that I've done alongside Off the Grid. And I would say most folks start with burnout. And at this point, they're often still on the platform. Like you're there and you're burnt out. And the burnout is part of what gets us to leave. Like we just can't make ourselves make posts, can't make ourselves do stories, like can't make ourselves learn video. Like it's that sort of burnout where you're just like, I cannot. And that's where we begin. Stage 1 of leaving social media. Once we decide to leave, so then something really different happens. So once we decide to leave, we often get this like renewed burst of energy, right? Like I've decided to leave and now I can announce my exit. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna tell everyone. And I make it like now there's like a newfound purpose for our social shares, for our posts or whatever they may be. And so we have this like energy to do it. And normally, what will often happen is that our post announcing we're leaving will be one of our most engaged with posts of like all time. Like we get excited about making content about leaving and people get excited about that content. I see this all the time. I cannot tell you how many people I'm like, yeah, I announced I was leaving and it just got way more engagement than anything I'd posted all year, all month, all season, whatever. It's true. And I love you. And I'm so happy that your post got engagement, but also it's not, I don't know how to be a little frank. Like it's not that special. Like it is a common pattern. And I only emphasize that because I don't want it to suck you back in, right? So some people see that and they're like, okay, well, maybe I could just have this all the time. So maybe I need to back off my commitment to leave. Maybe I'm not really going to leave. But dear listener, leave. If you've announced that you're leaving, go ahead and leave. Don't let that engagement suck you back in. People are engaging because they share the sentiment. They wish they had the courage to leave. So stay brave and step away. This is part of stage 2. So stage 2 is something that I call a content creation frenzy. I need a better name for it, but that's what I got right now. So it's definitely something I did when I left social media. And it came up again in my conversation with Joy, and I'm starting to see it more and more often. So for Joy and I both, like we made a lot of content to announce our exit. And then when we left, we had this habit of just like we were making content for social media almost every day. So we just took that to our other platforms. For my experience, when I was leaving, I was making all this content and I told people, I was like, get on my newsletter, get on my newsletter, get on my newsletter. That's the only place you're going to hear from me. And then let me tell you, after I left social media, I sent more newsletters the month after I left social media than I probably sent like in all of last year. Maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think I was sending like 3 a month for the 2 or 3 months after I left social. Now it's like 1 every other month, more likely for my personal list. But I think that what I noticed is like social media gives us this habit of creating a lot of content really quickly and just pushing it out, like create, publish really fast. And we stay in that rhythm often. Like we ramp it up in the process of leaving, and then we need to like send it somewhere else. We have all this momentum. We've got this habit and we point it in another direction. It's about putting it out there for other people. So stage 1 was burnout, the exhaustion that comes when you're finally ready to go. And stage 2 was content creation frenzy of, oh my gosh, I got to announce I'm going to leave, I'm going to make so much stuff. And now I've got this habit and I'm just going to keep making stuff all the time. But we're going to start moving into stage 3 here. So the thing about leaving social is that your content creation is no longer met by immediate engagement and affirmation. So when you post on social media, we've been trained to post and like watch for the likes, and like the affirmation comes in immediately. We've all been turned into these sorts of like content machines and affirmation machines, right? That we're just like engaging. We've been trained to engage, and we've been trained to expect and desire engagement. And so on social media, there is this real dopamine loop that's happening. We're like trained our brains to desire it and expect it and need it and want it. And that's part of what makes it so hard. And we don't get it because we feel so let down by that. All of that's happening and kind of trained into us on social media. But when you're sending newsletters or publishing podcast episodes, you don't get that immediate hit of adrenaline and dopamine like you do when you post on social media, right? Like you send a newsletter out into the world, it's kind of like crickets. Or like you publish a podcast episode and like you're not going to hear anything immediately, right? Or if you're like me, you've like scheduled it 2 weeks out. So by the time it goes live, you're like, oh shit, I forgot. That's what we're talking about today. Like today, everyone heard me say XYZ, even though I said it months ago, when I recorded it. So leaving social media really changes the pace of feedback. And over time, I found our content creation frenzy slows down because our feedback loops kind of soften and dissolve. Now, I am not a scientist, so if I've got all the science wrong here, my apologies. But I think the sentiment will hopefully ring true for folks who have left social. It's like over time, we kind of unlearn this behavior, our neural pathways change, and we're not in that same expectation, that same loop of share feedback, share feedback. For me now, it's like share feedback. Sorry, that was weird. But I think that what I'm trying to point to here is everything slows back down. And that is where we enter stage 3. And I'm calling this one return to human pace. At this point, when I share and receive feedback, it's happening at a pace where my body can process it. My emotions can process it. My nervous system can stay regulated because it's not happening so fast. Like my sharing takes longer. I let things simmer for longer. I wait longer to share them. By the time I share them, I feel much more like confident in them and secure in what I've said and what I am sharing. And then it takes some time for people to experience and receive that. And the feedback comes in a little slower. And I find that it's a little more considered than it ever was on social media. And when we return to human pace, like the feedback we're getting is often like an email or a voice message. It's not, just that simple like or quick comment or emojis. Not that those things aren't beautiful too. I'm just trying to point to the ways that we return to human pace. We move a little slower. We move at a pace that our nervous systems and our emotional, psychological bodies can process the inputs that are coming, the feedback that's coming. And it feels great, in my opinion. Like it takes time and it can be stressful and challenging in the experience. But I think over time, we start to find our own unique tempos. So, human pace, I'm not trying to say here is the same for everyone. I'm kind of differentiating a human pace and a technological pace or a social media pace. Each human will have their own human pace. So, yours will likely be different than mine. And I think that what's important is that we're finding our own tempo and not the speed and frequency demanded by a platform. Often, part of the reason social media feels so uncomfortable is because it's like forcing us to produce and consume at an inhuman pace. And for some of us, we might be able to ramp up to that a little easier than others. So, like, I feel like I'm a very fast processor. I attribute that to my Gemini moon in my 6th house. Like, I work fast and do fast. I don't have a long attention span for it, but I can move quickly. Lots of folks can't. If you got a good old fashioned Taurus prominent chart, you're going to move a little slower. And that's okay. It's beautiful. It's necessary. It's healing. But it can also just feel like you're failing or like something's wrong with you when you're told you need to move at the pace of social media. So if that feels resonant, you're amazing. You're wonderful. Your pace is just right for you. And I really invite you to make your way through the leaving social media process such that you can actually get back in touch with your pace and affirm it and affirm yourself in that process. Let's recap real quick before we move on to the next 2 stages. So, stage 1 is burnout, that moment where you just cannot do anything else on social media. Stage 2 is content creation frenzy, where you get super pumped about announcing your exit and then create a ton of content around that and afterwards. Stage 3 is where you return to your human pace and find the tempo, speed, and frequency that works for you for sharing. Then we enter stage 4. You've returned to human pace, and what comes next? I'm calling this one the I'm loving it stage, to steal the slogan from McDonald's. Don't sue me. In the I'm loving it stage, this is where you've left social, you've reconnected with yourself, and you are in your lane. Like in an ideal world, which none of us live in, you stay here forever, right? You're just like, I'm doing me. It's working great. But also, life happens. Sometimes we are not loving it, no matter what McDonald's tells us. Sometimes business isn't great. Sometimes we're in a tough spot with our personal mental health. Sometimes life is just hard. And so, as much as, this is a stage of leaving social media, I think that it has to recognize like that returning to human pace isn't going to like resolve all of our problems. Being off social media does not resolve all of your problems. And so at those moments, of course, I would encourage you to have a nice buffet of self-care and community practices to take care of yourselves. And if it is a business issue, if what's making you not love it is that business isn't great in that moment, that's when I recommend the Leaving Social Media Toolkit. That's when I recommend those creative marketing experiments that are a part of the toolkit, especially the ones that focus on direct sales. That's when I recommend the Business Success Without Social Media course, making sure your fundamentals are in a good place. That's the stuff that can kind of help get us through those moments, help us really support our business and ourselves in succeeding without social media. I also recommend all those things before you leave social media so you have a great foundation set up in the process. I've gotten a few emails from folks who are like, is this course for me if I don't have a business yet or if I haven't left social media yet? Like, absolutely. Set yourself up for success. Okay, finally, we're on stage 5. So we're headed into one that I really hesitated to write or to share or to speak aloud. I'm not sure it's true for everyone. These 5 stages may not apply to you at all. And this stage 5 is what I've experienced personally. So this is a really personal one. Maybe you'll never experience it. That's cool. But I believe in sharing transparently and vulnerably. So here I am. Now that I'm 2 years off social media, I left social media 2 years ago. I stepped away from my personal brand on Instagram and other places. And now that it's been 2 years, I've started to get a little lonely, both in my in business and in my personal life. I noticed over the past year loneliness creeping in. And I noticed just really missing the parasocial relationships that I had through social media. So when I left social media, I would say a lot of my parasocial network fell away. The friends that I was, in communication with, IRL friends, beloved people, we all stayed in touch and were really intentional about choosing how we'd stay in touch. And I love my close group of friends. But what I noticed is that, there weren't as many of them. And I missed the connection to a larger group of people who I felt shared values and interests with me. And I think some of the reason I felt that is I also, in the process of leaving social media, moved locations. So I moved from my really rich network of gorgeous people in Chicago to be closer to my family in Nebraska. And this is a much different and smaller place. And so I haven't recreated the same type of community here. You may leave social media and it doesn't impact you because you stay because you don't also move away from all your friends. I like to apparently pile it on to myself. But what I've noticed is that 2 years off social media, it does take more effort to keep in touch with folks. And I think that's okay. I think that my relationships are way stronger now because I'm putting in the effort than they ever were when I let social media mediate them for me. So I think that my relationships have really benefited from the folks in them really participating actively instead of just fire reacting to everything, which, I did, which is great. And I also think that because of the changes that have happened to social media in the past 2 years since I left, I'm hearing from my friends that they can't even keep up with their friends there either. I think that some of what I'm feeling is a more general cultural shift. We're all having to reconfigure how we're friends again, coming out of the pandemic, coming out of a period of intensive social media use for so many of us, coming out of a shift from Instagram to TikTok, where Instagram was originally at least about following your friends, and TikTok, that's never been the premise. It's about looking into strangers' lives more than anything, I would say. And so I think we're all reconfiguring this. We're all figuring it out again together. And so my stage 5 of the leaving social media process has been cultivating deeper forms of connection. And I figured that out because I was feeling lonely, or I've stepped into that because the loneliness started to show up. I think, in the returning to human pace and the I'm loving it phase, I was just in this like deep, beautiful love affair with myself. And then, not that that faded, but like, I got to the next stage of the relationship with myself and I was like, okay, but now I really want to connect with others. And so I've been figuring out how to do that, both in my personal life and in my professional life. I'm like, what is being social without social media? Back to that question yet again. I definitely think I figured out what is marketing without social media marketing. And now I'm figuring out what is social without social media. So, yeah, that's the honest share, I guess, which is like, yes, you can leave social media and everything can be amazing. You can leave social media and it can be hard. Both are true. I think what's most important is to be honest with yourself in the process and to implement some strategies. That's what I've shared with you in so many of the resources alongside Off the Grid. Like, implement some strategies so that you can succeed. Again, that just like bailing and ghosting, I guess it's a strategy, but not an effective one. So, if you've been building a community on social media and you would like to leave, I think that seeing the path ahead by listening to this episode is a great way to kind of set yourself up with the emotional and self care and community support you might need to navigate the process. And then using something like my 5-step process for leaving can help you put in place a thoughtful marketing strategy that will just make sure you have a soft place to land away from social instead of, leaving social and then thinking about how you're going to set up another community. You can transition a lot of your community somewhere else that can hold you as you're figuring all of this out. Before I wrap this up, there is one more perspective I wanted to share. As I was working on this episode and kind of sitting in this and prepping it and thinking about it, I came across another podcast with someone talking about their experience leaving social media. And that podcast was Bewildered with Martha Beck. And the guest was Elizabeth Gilbert, who's definitely been mentioned on this show before, unlike probably every other podcast that I would ever listen to. But in that episode, which I'll link in the show notes, Elizabeth Gilbert talks about how when she left Instagram, she really went through a period of withdrawal. And this was not my experience. So I really wanted to bring it here in case it's something that you feel or you are feeling. So to quote her from the episode, she says there, and I'm quoting, "When I left, I felt incredibly uncomfortable, lonely, sad, scared, jacked up, agitated. Mostly fear for me. Anything that I've ever put down, which is the sort of recovery term for like not using it anymore, has come with a period of withdrawal that for me always felt like fear." And I felt it. And that's when I knew for me this had become a drug because I was going through the withdrawal of, oh, I don't have my drug. I don't have my comfort. So I sat through it and I felt it. I sat there and I felt that the shakiness, the jerkiness of wanting to reach for this thing. I felt the sense of I'm not connected anymore. I'm not relevant anymore. I don't know what's going on anymore in the world. Nobody cares about me. I'll be forgotten. All these deep psychological withdrawals. And then after a couple of weeks, it settled. So I want to share that because I do think it's a relatively common or shared experience. Many of us experience that jittery, constantly reaching for the phone-ness during one or more of the stages of leaving social media that I talked about here today. But what I loved in this episode, she also reports back, like she made it through all of that in stages 1 and 2, and then some magic happened. So quoting her again, "After it settled, back came my initial factory settings of, oh my God, the world is so beautiful. I'm going to go for a really long walk." And I'd been asking my higher powers and my guides and my muses to send me an idea for a novel. I'd been asking for 2 years. For 2 years, I'd written in my journal almost every day, "Hey, anytime you guys have an idea for me for a novel, I would love one." And they would write back, "When we've got an idea for you, you'll be notified." That was the conversation that I had for 2 years. And I have enough trust in my creative process to believe I'll be notified, to let me know, and then I'll do it. I'll do what they tell me. 2 weeks after I got off Instagram, the idea came. Beautiful, right? Isn't that so beautiful for her? She is not promising and I am not promising that you will have a beautiful novel idea that comes 2 weeks after you leave Instagram. But I think that the piece of that return to human pace, of that I'm loving it stage, is that so much can emerge. And I think that was one of the biggest things I found when I left social media is just when I really got through the first 3 stages, I had all this clarity around what I desired and how to support myself. And that meant everything. It changed everything for me. And I didn't write a novel, but I did create a business. I did launch this podcast. All of that came through from the clarity of leaving social media and making it through the different stages of this process. So, maybe hearing these 5 stages helps you see what's coming if you leave, and learning that you might be divinely inspired on the other side is the inspiration that you need to make the shift. If so, I'm cheering you on. You got this. And if you're listening to this and you're totally not leaving social media yet or ever, that's cool too. You don't have to. I have no personal stake in whether or not you actually exit social media. I'm happy to be here supporting you and thinking about just exploring the idea of how you might market your business or share your work differently. And I think that's it for today, friends. Make sure you subscribe in your favorite listening platform so you don't miss an episode. And go download the Leaving Social Media Toolkit. You'll get that free resource and more emails from me about new episodes of the show, special giveaways, lots of fun stuff coming up. So all of that's at softersounds.studio/off-the-grid, or the toolkit's at softersounds.studio/BYEIG. Big love to all of you. I'll see you next time. And until then, let's get off the grid. Thanks for listening to Off the Grid. Don't forget to grab your free Leaving Social Media toolkit at offthegrid.fun/toolkit. This podcast is a Softer Sounds production. Our music is by Melissa Caitlin Carter of Making Audio Magic, and our logo is by Natelier Studio. I'm your host, Amelia Ruby, and until next time, I'll see you off the grid and on the interweb.
Let's